What we have here is a small car that looks like a two-tone snail, but this is actually one of the most significant cars of the 20th century. It's also one of the wackiest, the wildest, and the weirdest, and in this video we are going over all the crazy gadgets and gizmos in the Citroen 2CV. First of all, what is it? Well, the make of this car is this word, and Americans have a really hard time with this word, including myself, but all my French friends have really corrected me. Apparently the French say Citroën. Here in America we say Citroen. In the UK they say Citroen. However you want to pronounce it, it is one of the oldest car companies, it's one of the most established car companies, and they've built some of the most incredible cars throughout history. So 2CV is actually short for 2 chevaux vapeur, and what that literally translates to is 2 steam horses. That was basically the nominal engine output of the original 2CV. Now this one is a 6. No, it's not a V6. A 6 means that it's essentially the big block, and then Charleston was a special edition they did in the 1980s. Now they built these cars from 1948 through 1990, incredibly popular not only in France but all around the world. They built them in several locations, but they never were really sold here in the US, partly because they're a little bit slow. Let's pop the hood. Now to open the hood on a 2CV, there are no levers to pull. Rather, you just reach underneath the front bumper. There's this simple piece of wire, it kind of feels like a coat hanger. Pull up on that and then you can lift up on the hood. Now the hood is positively enormous, as is the hood rod, and the hood rod latches here in the middle because the hood itself is incredibly super flimsy, and if they put it on one edge of the hood, it probably would bend it and then fall down on your face. But that's how you open the hood on a 2CV. Now, more about the engine. Now these cars were built to mobilize France, specifically rural France in pre-war Europe. And then of course the Germans invaded and occupied France, and they hid all the 2CV concepts and didn't launch it till 1948. But because it was meant to mobilize basically folks that lived in rural France, it had to be very simple and very affordable, and we see that in the engine. All 2CVs are powered by just 2 cylinders. They are horizontally opposed and air-cooled cylinders, so kind of like half of a Volkswagen Beetle engine, but more like an old BMW motorcycle engine in its basic construction. Now, the horsepower output. I mentioned 2CV stood for 2 steam horses. That translated to just 9 horsepower when this car launched in the late 1940s, and that was from 375 cc's of Fury. They then upped it to over 400 cc's, and this one, being the 2CV6, has the largest engine they offered, 602 cc's. So this motor makes a whopping 29 horsepower. The little 2CV was designed to be as simple as possible to manufacture, as cheap as possible to manufacture, and as basic as possible to fix, and there's a lot of really clever engineering and able to achieve those missions. A lot of really kind of clever and simple design touches that you don't see really in a lot of other cars. So let's talk about the doors. Now first of all, the door handles are bizarre. This door handle is locked right now, and as you can see, you can spin it around 360 degrees in both directions. So when you go to unlock the door, you simply put the key in the slot, turn the key, and then you have to spin it until it catches, and then you can unlatch the door. What they're doing here, rather than incorporating a standard door lock, when you lock the door, you're simply disconnecting the handle from the latch, which is pretty weird. Now the pros are very easy to make, very simple and unlikely to break. The cons are though that you can't actually lock a 2CV from the inside. You have to get the key out and stick it in the slot, or you can't lock the car. Then we come to the door construction. These doors are wafer thin. They're incredibly thin, and you know, by modern standards really flimsy, but keep in mind this was not a car designed for safety. This was a car designed to get folks to church in post-war France, and that's just the beginning of the door weirdness. The rear door handles are the opposite of the front door handles, so there's no way to lock or unlock them from the outside. What you have to do instead is flick a little lever on the inside, and then they're permanently locked from the outside, and then to unlock them you need those lanky French arms. You reach all the way in. And then plop them open. The windows on a 2CV are one of the best parts of the car because there are no window winders, obviously no electric windows. Instead, you've got a hinged window that hinges about halfway up the design. So push in on this latch located halfway through the door, that unhooks the window, and then you simply grab them and open them up toward the top of the door frame. And then up here, there's a little bunion with a wire, just a piece of wire in there that hooks into a slot. And that's how they secure into place. To close the window, push the little lever on the bunion, and then you can fold them closed. Now, there's a couple issues with this design. First of all, there's no way to grab the window from the inside, so instead, you just have to let it slam. But they did think of something pretty clever. If you don't want to open the window all the way, you can use this little piece of bent wire, stick it into this latch, and then you've got, you know, a little vent window. And the rear window of a 2CV doesn't go down whatsoever. And one more fun piece of 2CV window trivia, these third windows, the rear quarter windows, not every 2CV had these. The early ones just had a piece of sheet metal here. These came later in the production cycle. So 2CVs are convertibles. And you're probably thinking, what a premium feature to give 1940s French farmers. But in fact, a big reason they're convertibles is because it meant Citroen got to use less steel. But they work in a really kind of unconventional French way. So let's fold the top back on a 2CV. So first things first, we need to unlatch the header bar. So fold down the sun visors, they flip out of the way. And then there are two latches, one on each side. Flip them up, and then we can move on to step 2. The next step is to fold back the front portion of the roof into this sunroof mode, which is a nice feature to have. And then there's a little button clasp here. You're gonna wanna undo that and then lift up on the top portion of this panel. You want to fold the header bar back, and then you can see the whole roof is just kind of not attached to anything. This is how we actually fold it into the retracted position. So now we can start the process of rolling up the roof. That's right, you physically have to grab it and kind of roll it like a towel. It's a little bit easier if you have two people, one on each side, but it can be done pretty quickly with one person. And then you can see you can actually roll it all the way back. You're going to want to stop right about here before you hit the rear window, because if you reach into the car, you'll find this little simple rubber strap that makes its way to the rearmost clasp. Push in on that, you've got one on each side, and now your burrito top is folded back and you're ready for some open air convertibling. And if you think that's an extreme measure to go through to save some steel, take this into consideration. The oldest 2CVs actually didn't even use a trunk panel. Instead, that piece of fabric continued all the way back to the rear of the vehicle, and then you just unclasp it to get into the trunk. That's how extreme they were about saving steel in post-war France. So the steering wheel in this car is very unique. Obviously, it's a non-power assisted rack, although this one does have a steering lock, which was pretty advanced. This one is a 1982, so it's one of the later 2CVs, and as such, it has a plastic steering wheel with a single spoke. Citroen was very well known for doing these single spoke steering wheels. The idea is they're a little bit safer in an accident, and you can clearly see all the gauges without, you know, having spokes and stuff to interrupt your field of view. The early cars did not have a single spoke steering wheel. They were just like a steel wheel with a couple spokes, but the later cars have a plastic safety wheel. So the gauge cluster on a 2CV is a very simple piece of equipment, once again, to save money and cost. Obviously no tachometer. In this case, we have a fuel gauge, a voltmeter, and then your odometer, and that's pretty much it. The older cars were even simpler. They just had one dial that was for the speedometer. And fun fact about the oldest 2CVs, the wiper controls were actually hooked into the speedo cable, so you could either have your speed or have windshield wipers, and then if you came to a stop, your windshield wipers would stop altogether. So probably the craziest thing about any 2CV, the shifter. It looks like an umbrella handle with a pool ball bolted to the end of it. Really funky, but really easy to use once you get used to it, and very, very intuitive. Now the shifter kind of pivots in and out on this rod, and then it twists left and right, and that's really how you change gears. And it's sort of similar to a conventional H pattern when you think about it. Now it's a dog leg first gear. So first gear, twist to the left and pull back. And you can see the whole stick extends backwards. Second gear, center the stick and push forward. Third gear, pass through neutral and pull back. And then fourth gear, twist to the right and push forward. So really, you got 1, 2, 3, and then 4. 2 and 3 are in line because that's what you want on, for example, the Nürburgring or Laguna Seca. But for real, it is actually pretty convenient just having your 2 most common gears in and out. Now, the real magic to this is when you see what's going on when you manipulate this ball and stick. When you pop the hood, you can clearly see what's going on. There's a hole in the firewall. This is where the shifter pops out, and then it's connected to another rod that literally just simulates an H pattern to the transmission. So check this out. That's first gear there, then second, third, and then fourth. So just a standard H pattern. It's just the way that they hinge it into the cab. It gets a little weird with the push and pull. What the 2CV does better than pretty much any car is demonstrate that clever engineering can be done incredibly cheap with very basic thought and can last a really long time. Take, for example, the headlight design. So a lot of cars have auto-leveling headlights, and when they go wrong, it can be hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to replace. Well, the 2CV has leveling headlights too. It's just a little bit more basic. So the headlights are connected via this rod, and they pivot up and down via a knob on the inside. The idea is if you have loaded up your 2CV with stuff from the farmer's market, you're going to be blinding people at night. Twist that knob, bring the headlights down. Very simple and almost never breaks, unless it's like this car, in which case the cable has seized up and it's broken. But it's a very easy thing to fix, at least. Oh no, they do work. That's crazy. Just kidding. The headlights do work. I'm sorry, I just wasn't twisting hard enough. So there's some pretty weird looking stuff on the front of the 2CV engine, but it really is all very basic, familiar things once you figure out what's going on. So for example, this right here, at the very front of the car, you know, almost in front of the cooling fan, is the coil. And obviously it's a 2-cylinder, so you've got one spark plug lead going one way, the other spark plug lead going the other. But basically, the engine itself on a 2CV starts here and ends here. It's entirely in front of the front axle, and of course fully air cooled, so there's no radiator, no coolant, nothing like that. Very, very simple. Now the transmission is behind that, and then you pretty much have all this empty space that is being used for absolutely nothing. It is a trans-axle, but very, very, very cleverly, the brakes are actually inboard on a 2CV, so they're not out here on the edges of the wheels. They are located, basically bolted to the side of the transmission, which is pretty clever. A bunch of other kind of little weird things like these heater tubes that take hot air off the exhaust manifold and funnel it into the cabin. And I do like the air filter. You just simply twist this panel, lift it up, and then you can see there is one very, very, very dirty air filter, which clearly we're going to have to change, but then plop it back in the middle. There's these little marks you line up and slot it into place. Super simple. These all had carburetors from the factory. I don't believe there was ever a fuel injected model, and just almost nothing to go wrong. You can pretty much fix anything on a 2CV with a super simple toolkit. A lot of the body panels will actually slide off on pins. You don't even need tools to take some of the body panels off. Very easy cars to work on, although getting parts in the US can be a little hit and miss. Another crazy part about the 2CV, they have a crank start. So they give you a crank, you put it into a hole located in the front of the vehicle, and then you twist. Oh, I now see why people could break their arm doing this. Did you see that? Even me, I have no upper body strength, can crank start a 2CV. So let's check out the trunk space in a Citroen 2CV. God, I just love saying that. So the trunk hinges up pretty much vertically, and then there's also this little rod that you can plop into position right there. So some interesting stuff back here. Obviously, full-size spare tire. Behind that is a pretty standard jack. Exposed sheet metal absolutely everywhere back here. And this is pretty funky. Let me show you how this works. This is basically a nose condom, and it slots in front of the grille and basically blocks the airflow to the engine. The idea being that in the wintertime, you don't need as much airflow because it's an air-cooled engine, and you basically want to keep the heat in the engine so you stay warm in the cabin. So plop this little condom into the grill. You can see it blocks out a lot of the airflow, and that's how you keep things cool. Now, I think the early cars, well, I know they had a different grill, and I think the early cars actually used a fabric nose blocker. The later ones just used a piece of plastic. So you'll notice there's no fabric covering the backs of the seats, but what I want to show you is down here. Do you see these little knobs? You can actually pull these outward, and what these do is allow you to remove the rear seats so you can use them basically as picnic benches, which is pretty clever. Now, the early cars were even easier. These late cars have little latches, but very clever piece of engineering. Nice for those French outings. So to the right of the steering wheel is this stalk with a 0 written on it. Twist it once for your parking lights, twist it again for your headlights, and then you have both high and low beam by pulling in and out. And this weird little stalk that comes out of the dashboard, that's supposed to be flicked with a finger. That is essentially flash to pass, so you can let people know you're trying to get by in your 2CV. You will never use that switch in your entire life because there's nowhere to pass in a 2CV. So down here is your choke, and one thing I do really like that they've done with the choke is when you pull it out, turn the choke on, it actually turns on and starts to glow. Push it in, and it turns itself off. That's a nice little touch. This knob right here is for the fresh air vent. So you twist it, what happens is this little prong basically pokes up on a piece of sheet metal, and then if you look up here, the vent simply opens and closes when you twist the knob. Now the temperature regulation in a 2CV, pretty simple. You got cold, you got hot, you got hot, you got cold. Everything in here is very, very flimsy, it's worth noting, but you know, all in the effort to save costs. Door handles on the inside are dirt simple and very confusing for passengers because they don't know what to look for, but this rod is your door handle. It's connected to a different rod, and that's literally how you just get in and out of the 2CV, and it's even more confusing in the back. For rear passengers, the handle is completely hidden and you wouldn't know where to find it unless you watch this video because it's located down here by the latch. There's this little piece of plastic. Pull up, you can see that moves the handle, and that's how you get out of the rear seat of a Citroen 2CV. So the suspension in these cars is so weird, and it was super innovative, and even still it works incredibly well. But here are the basics. The first thing you need to know is they're incredibly softly sprung. I am not a strong individual. That is one arm, and I mean, you can turn the car into a waterbed. But the way it works is you've got independent suspension on all four corners. You've got the swing arms, and they are attached to springs located down here in the middle of the vehicle by these little push rods, essentially. So you've got leading arms and trailing arms. I want to make that very clear, actually. So they look a little weird when you pull the body off of them. These are body on frame, and you get a good look at the suspension, but leading arms and trailing arms. And then you've got the spring tubes in the middle. But the most interesting thing is two springs on either end of the spring tube, but then the spring tube itself also moves back and forth. And the result of that is when you basically get a pitch situation on one end of the vehicle, the other end of the vehicle will lift in the opposite direction, which gives you this kind of magic carpet-like ride, especially over speed bumps. Here's a video of me taking a speed bump at 25 miles an hour, and the car, it's almost a little unnerving because it lifts and then it falls in the wrong places. You expect it to behave differently than it really does. But the result of this is that you could drive these cars over a plowed field in France with a basket of eggs without breaking any. That was, of course, one of the infamous design requirements. The other weird part of the suspension is the early cars did not use shock absorbers whatsoever. They had these basically friction dampers. The later cars do have shock absorbers, but you'll notice they are located on their side, which is a little funky. Okay, here comes 602 cc's of fury. And here's how we release the parking brake on a 2CV. Push in on the button, push in, and now we are ready to go. So the shifting thing definitely freaks people out at first, but it's very dirt simple to use once you kind of get the hang of it. And then you'll drive it like any other manual. Guarantee within the hour, you're gonna have it down squat. And it's a very, very forgiving car to drive. Even though it's not power assisted steering, even though you know, the brakes are somewhat basic, although this car does have pretty advanced brakes in 1982. It's just all very simple to use, and it's a very approachable classic to drive. And if you live on a dirt road like this, you'll quickly see the benefits of having such a softly sprung ride, because you can take bumps, especially in a straight line in this car, at just about any speed, and it'll soak it up. Add to that this car has, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 inches of ground clearance, and it'll go places you just wouldn't believe. So when you're on the road, the power is limited. So I'm doing 30 kilometers an hour in second gear, full throttle. There's 45K, 50K, and 60K there. Top speed in Colorado, I find, is somewhere around 60 miles an hour, maybe 65. I think this car probably could do for a tune-up, which it'll be getting here shortly. So it's a relaxed car. Basically what you do with a 2CV is you drive it at full throttle everywhere, and then you can control the speed by shifting. That's how you decide how fast you want to go. And once you get used to the fact that you're not going to be winning any stoplight Grand Prix and you might show up to your destination a couple minutes later, it really is okay. So the ride is really kind of alarming at first, especially the body roll. But from folks I've talked to, and I do think that this is probably true, it's almost impossible to roll a 2CV. Just the way the suspension and steering geometry works is when you're right on the limit, and they just stick like glue and they refuse to topple over. So you can see videos of people racing these things and doing really stupid stuff with these things around turns. And yes, they'll understeer and that kind of thing, but it looks like they're right on the edge of falling over all the time. But they just don't. You'll squeal the wheel like I did there. You'll lean 20, 25 degrees, but you'll probably make it to your destination shiny side up. So the 2CV was built from 48 through 1990. Built them in a couple different locations. This one is a 1982 and it's a Charleston. And what they did in the early 1980s, they came out with a special edition that was two-tone, and they had like a maroon and a black one, and then like a gray and a black one, and this was the yellow and the black one. And people really do like these cars a lot, and they are quite collectible. The early cars with under 400 cc's I've read are kind of undrivable in modern traffic, although I'm sure a 2CV purist will disagree with me on that. The later cars, like the 602cc car, like this one with 29 horsepower, is more usable, and especially at altitude, I think this would be my choice if you're looking to buy a 2CV. But just a lovely thing to drive, very reliable, super durable, very simple to fix, but I know French cars don't have a particularly great reputation for longevity. These cars, they really do. So love or hate the 2CV, it is an incredible machine. It really is just so weird to drive, very slow, but you can really see why these cars were popular in their homeland and even in developing countries all around the world, because they were just so simple, durable, and basic to live with. The kind of pinnacle of basic transportation. Now, here in the US, do they work? Not really. They're a little too slow for modern roads. They're just, you have to be really wacky to buy them, especially because they're pretty expensive. They're typically like, I don't know, $15,000 to $25,000. I think this one we paid $17,000 for, which is a lot of money. You can get yourself a really nice Beetle for 17 grand. But if you want something just totally off the wall weird, the 2CV should definitely be on your short list. Now, I've forgotten a ton of stuff in this video. I just know it because there's so much folklore and interesting things about this car that I'll have to discover over the next couple of years of ownership. But let me know what you think of the weird and wacky 2CV in the comments section below. And as always, this has been Tommy with the Fastlane Car. Check out tflcar.com for the latest and greatest and weird and wacky reviews.